Intercourse by Dworkin. Part 3. Power, Status, and Hate. Quote, "Is that a gun in your pocket, or are you just glad to see me?" End quote. Mae West. Chapter 8. Law. Intercourse is an activity heavily regulated. By law, God's law in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, for instance, the secular state, religious tribunals, tribal codes, customs, and taboos. Communities of every description throughout time have had rules on intercourse that say with some specificity that people will fuck in this way and not in that way, with this person and not with that person, under this circumstance and not under that circumstance. The rules are not benign homilies on the good life, nor are they abstract standards. Those who break the rules can be punished with death or exile or prison. Society says, with the authority of its police power, how intercourse will and will not occur. Any act so controlled by the state, prescribed and prescribed in detail, cannot be private in the ordinary sense. Privacy is essentially a sphere of freedom immune from regulation by the state. In that sense, intercourse has never occurred in private. The society and its police, including priests in religious states, have had too much to do with establishing the terms of the act itself, not just what people do and do not do, but also what people know, how conscious and self-consciousness are formed, and how acts are valued and devalued, how both the license to do and the stigma against doing are then expressed in actual sexual behavior, dread, and longing. The society with police power behind it imposes both restrictions and obligations. It punishes forbidden behavior, but it also punishes failure to comply with mandated behavior. Many laws about sex are laws demanding sexual compliance, especially from women. Compliance can occur behind closed doors, out of the public view, but it is not private at all. It is a social act in conformity with a social requirement. The compliance itself is a building block of the society as a whole. Breaking the law is widely construed to be antisocial. Forbidden acts are said to hurt society as a whole. They are social, not private, from the point of view of the law. Intercourse has never been comprehended by the law as a private act of personal freedom, except in one limited sense. Those who belong to men as chattel, or who are used by them as sexual objects, the modern equivalent of chattel, can be encompassed in a man's privacy such that they disappear altogether inside it. The state can manage a sudden and sensitive respect for privacy when it functions as a prison cell for women, or a child, or a slave, or any civilly inferior person. A woman, for instance, inside a man's privacy, will never be able to reach or invoke the law, even if he is breaking it on her body. Privacy in sex means that a man has a right to shield himself from state scrutiny when sexually using civil inferiors. Aside from the disingenuous use of so-called privacy as a means of protecting the active sexual dominance of men over others, intercourse is, in essence and in reality, social, not private. Intercourse both presumes and requires a society of at least two persons before it can occur at all, and the state is concerned about the nature of that society, how it is constructed, that it be hierarchical, that it be male-dominated. In each act of intercourse, a society is formed, and the distribution of power in that society is the state interest at stake. Who constitutes the society, what each does, the place of each in each act, the value of each, is what the state seeks to control. Gender is what the state seeks to control. Who is the man here? Which is the woman? How do we keep the man on top? How do we keep the man the man? How to render the woman inferior in fucking so that she cannot recover herself from the carnal experience of her own subjugation. Intercourse is supposed to be natural, and in it a man and a woman are supposed to show and do what each is by nature. Society justifies its civil subordination of women by virtue of what it articulates as the quote unquote natural roles of men and women in intercourse, the quote unquote natural subjugation of women to men in the act. God and nature are not enemies in this argument. Divine law and sociobiologists, for instance, agree on the general rightness of male dominance. Nature, however, cannot be counted on. Women do not know how to be women exactly. Men constantly fail to be men. The rules governing intercourse protect errant human beings from the failures of their own natures. Natural women and natural men do not, alas, on their own, always meet the mark. Nature and pleasure do not always coincide. Male dominance is not always so certain or so easy. Women, not natural enough, resent the presumption of natural inferiority. Law steps in where nature fails, virtually everywhere. Laws create nature, a male nature and a female nature, and a natural intercourse, by telling errant, unnatural human beings what to do and what not to do, to protect and express their real nature, the real male, the real female, the real hierarchy that nature or God created, putting man on top. Society makes laws that say who will put what where, when, and though folks keep getting it wrong, the law helps nature out by punishing those who are not natural enough and who want to put the wrong thing in the wrong place. The small, intimate society created for intercourse, one time or many, the social unit that is the fuck in action, must be one that protects male dominance. Every man is vulnerable to rebellion, pain, metaphoric castration, and real physical anguish at the point of entry. There is a sudden democracy of vulnerability. Vulnerability means, quote unquote, capable of being wounded, quote unquote, defenseless against injury. The penis needs the protection of the law, of awe, of power. Rebellion here, in intercourse, is the death of a system of gender hierarchy premised on a sexual victory over the vagina. The triumphant fuck is virtually synonymous with masculinity. The legitimacy of a man's civil dominance depends on the authenticity of his masculinity, which is articulated when he fucks. Masculinity itself means being as different from women as it is possible to be, and so, the laws regulating intercourse in general forbid those sex acts that break down gender barriers and license those sex acts and conditions that heighten gender polarity and antagonism. The laws that say who to fuck, when, how, and anatomically where keep the man differentiated in a way that seems absolute. Having power, one can break the law for pleasure, but the law itself is the mechanism for creating and maintaining power. Laws create male dominance and maintain it as a social environment. Male dominance is the environment we know in which we must live. It is our air, water, and earth. Laws shape our perceptions and knowledge of what male dominance is, of how it works, of what it means to us. Laws shape the experiences we have before we have them. Laws significantly predetermine how we will feel, will understand, what will happen to us in life. Laws established for humans the term laws established for humans the terms of our symbiosis with male dominance, what it takes from us to sustain itself over as the overall environmental system, what it gives to us to enable us to survive as individual organisms inside it. There is an ecology of male dominance, a complex, delicate, deliberate interaction between it, our rainforest, our desert, our sea, and us, the fragile organisms breathing in and out inside it because of necessity, not choice. On one level, laws are diagrammed on that ecology. They show the whole pattern of relations between us, the organisms, and and it, the environment. On another level, the more important one, laws are causal, not illustrative. Oh no, laws are causal, not illustrative. They make us do certain things in certain ways. They keep some people on top and some people on the bottom. They punish those who do not comply. They force compliance in those who do not want to be punished. They produce fear. They create order. In this, their active meaning. Laws are instrumental in organizing human energy, creativity, and potential into patterns of actual behavior, including sexual behavior. The purpose of laws on intercourse in a world of male dominance is to promote the power of men over women and to keep women sexually subjugated, accessible to men. These laws, great and small, work. They work by creating gender itself. They say what a man is in intercourse, in rights, in obligation. They say what a woman is in intercourse, in rights, in obligation. They forbid confusion between male and female. They bifurcate rights, responsibilities, behaviors, so that men and women in the same place at the same time remain creatures distinct from each other, strangers, the women less human than the men, with less dignity and less freedom, with lower civil status. The laws regulating intercourse are the laws most vital to making gender a social absolute that appears to have a metaphysical base, an inevitability rooted in existence itself. These same laws regulate, put a brake on, the kind of lust produced by male dominance by having sexual rights over inferiors. They keep men from destroying, through self indulgence, a sophisticated system of power that has lasted too long and ruined those who have rebelled against it. Quote, in the city of the world, end quote, wrote Augustine, quote, both the rulers themselves and the people they dominate are dominated by the lust for dominion, end quote. According to Augustine, the great carnal sins, quote, are hatched from the lust of power, from gratification of the eye, and from gratification of corrupt nature, end quote. A former world-class sinner himself, astute, keenly aware of the intense carnal pleasure of lust and domination, he described the quality of lust produced by the passion for dominance. Quote, such lust does not merely invade the whole body and outward members. It takes such complete and passionate possession of the whole man, both physically and emotionally, that what results is the keenest of all pleasures on the level of sensation. And, at the crisis of excitement, it practically paralyzes all power of deliberate thought. End quote. Before the fall, Augustine wrote, intercourse could take place, quote unquote, without the passion of lust. God had created male and female. Each had an appropriate nature. There were natural, yet Edenic sex roles in the garden. Quote, a man and his wife could play their active and passive roles in the drama of conception without the lecherous promptings of lust, with perfect serenity of soul and with no sense of disintegration between the body and soul. End quote. An honest sinner and an honest utopian. Augustine stresses the inner peace and human wholeness of an intercourse based on harmony, not lust, and he underscores the alienation and turmoil in intercourse based on the lust for dominance. Nature, however, is the same in Eden and outside of it. A man and his wife, active and passive roles in intercourse, a sexual intercourse even in Eden, of the fucker and the fucked. Nature in this usage means what God made, his will, his intention, the essence and meaning of creation, what a thing or being is in itself. God made, willed, intended, male and female, active and passive, in intercourse, male dominance without the kick. This is the nature God made. Male dominance has, in fact, had the cachet of being both natural and divine. Evolutionists, for instance, canned God, but not the essential male and female he created, and not intercourse as he intended it, male with female, active and passive. They found secular, science saturated arguments to support the same arrangement of human reality. Even without a belief in God, nature is what God made the way he made it. Crimes against nature, then, have been crimes against God, direct hits on him. Crimes against nature violate what beings are. For instance, the crime of sodomy violates what men are, their intrinsic nature. Augustine wrote, quote, sins against nature, therefore, like the sin of Sodom, are abominable and deserve punishment wherever and whenever they are committed. If all nations committed them, all alike would be held guilty of the same charge in God's law. For our Maker did not prescribe that we should use each other in this way. In fact, the relationship which we ought to have with God is itself violated when our nature, of which He is the author, is desecrated by perverted lust. End quote. The laws regulating intercourse, prescribing how we must use each other or be used, as well as prescribing how we must not use each other, are supposed to protect the authentic natures of men and women. Men being fucked like women moves in an opposite direction, so there is a rule against men being fucked like women. The rules on intercourse are intended to keep people away from the slippery slope God appears to dislike the most, a lessening of differences between the sexes, the conflation of male and female natures into one human nature. Sodom, then, a notorious crime against nature, male nature, would appear to be the real threat to male dominance as organized and maintained in the Judeo Christian system. Note: see Dworkin, Jews and Homosexuals from Right Wing Women, published in 1983, for discussion of how in ancient Greece sodomy was condoned and used to express male dominance, also for discussion on the particular vehemence of Christianity against the homosexual. In the Old Testament, it is prohibited as a capital crime, quote, "Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind, it is an abomination," end quote, Leviticus 18:22, quote, "And if a man lie with mankind as with womankind, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death, their blood shall be upon them," end quote, Leviticus 20:13. Adjacent verses also condemn, in the same terms, a man or a woman having intercourse with an animal, and that too is reckoned to be sodomy. Other capital crimes include adultery and various forms of incest. From the Old Testament to the end of the 18th century in Western Europe and the United States, sodomy was criminal, with rare exception on capital crime. The language of Leviticus was lifted, for instance, by, by Connecticut in its criminal sodomy statute of 1642. Quote, "That if any man shall lie with mankind as he lieth with womankind, both of them have committed abomination. They shall be put to death, except it shall appear that one of the parties has forced or under was forced or under 15 years of age." End quote. Typically, in secular law, sodomy was characterized as detestable, abominable, horrible, against nature. And in this superb effort, an 1837 North Carolina statute, quote, "the abominable and detestable crime against nature not to be named among Christians," end quote. The key elements are simple, clear, consistent. Against nature, abominable, detestable, lethal. In the 19th century, capital punishment was increasingly replaced by imprisonment, often for life, and hard labor as the penalties of choice. The first criminal sodomy statute to be repealed in the United States was repealed by the state of Illinois in 1962. The concept of a crime against nature, male nature, was so powerful that it resonated beyond the law itself, God's or man's. In culture, it came to mean that the person who did the act had the nature that was the crime. He was too feminine in the world of real, natural, unpolluted masculinity. Norman Mailer, for instance, combined the best of Leviticus and Proust when he wrote, quote, "Yes, it is the irony of prison life. that it is a world where everything is homosexual, and yet nowhere is the condition of being feminine male more despised. It is because one is used, one is a woman without the power to be female, one is fucked without a womb. End quote. Proust too described the quote unquote feminine male as one who craved masculinity in other men but was despised by them because of his femininity. In his Cities of the Plain, in remembrance of things past, Proust said that those who committed the crime of Sodom were men who were women inside. Because they were women inside, they wanted, sought, needed the male member. Ironically, see Mailer above, they are unable to get what they want because they want real men, masculine men, men with the right nature. The so called deviant himself has an orthodox religious view of that nature, expressed in sexual desire. But any such real man despises the femininity that makes the feminine male want him. Because they cannot have the masculine man they want, the feminine men are forced to buy male prostitutes to enact the sex and the virility they want. They are lonely and in deep despair. They are, quote, lovers who are almost precluded from the possibility of that love, the hope of which gives them the strength to endure so many risks and so much loneliness, since they are enamored of precisely the type of man who has nothing feminine about him, who is not an invert and consequently cannot love them in return. End quote. The irony is tragic for Proust. The feminine men are, quote, that race of being whose ideal is manly precisely because their temperament is feminine, and who in ordinary life resembles other men in appearance only, end quote. For Mailer, the dispossession of the man who want men is another occasion on which to extol the joys of impregnating women. Quote, for whatever else is in the act, lust, cruelty, the desire to dominate, or whole delights of desire, the result can be no more than a transaction, pleasurable, even all encompassing, but a transaction when no hint remains of the awe that a life in these circumstances can be conceived. End quote. It is, finally, the woman's potential to reproduce that distinguishes and affirms the real man. With the whole meaning of the fuck, gender, being resolved by its outcome in producing children. Sensual pleasure is not what distinguishes homosexual sodomy from heterosexual fucking. The woman bearing the child does, in religion, in Mailer. The deep feeling or experience of being a separate race haunts Proust. Having a nature that is itself unnatural, alien in existence, in being. The act of sodomy is not the crime against nature. The men themselves are the crime against nature. The law is internalized, a curse on which they are, a ubiquitous and inescapable social stigma. Quote, a race upon which a curse is laid, and which must live in falsehood and perjury, because it knows that its desire, that which constitutes life's dearest pleasure, is held to be punishable, shameful, an inadmissible thing. End quote. The men have become abominable and detestable and against nature, a separate race. This is because law creates nature. Nature is not in this sense trees or weeds or wind. It is gender, what men and women are, what a man is in intercourse, what a woman is in intercourse. The sodomy laws have an affirmative side, rich in meaning and persuasive power. Do not fuck men as if they are women. It is an abomination. The imperative is communicated in the blank spaces, as it were, to fuck women as if women are women, carnal chattel of men, proper objects for the lust of domination. The abomination is to do to men what is normally done to women in the fuck, the penetration, the possession, the contempt because she is less, lower in standing before the law or God, the right to use her, which is inevitably a right over her. Both Augustine and Mailer describe the lust of dominance in not dissimilar terms: an ecstasy, a frenzy, cruelty, all encompassing, dominance in the fuck as a supreme and superb pleasure. Men are not supposed to have to endure being the victims of this lust. Perhaps there is an implicit recognition that the subordination itself, the carnal experience of it, would change them, their so called nature, create in them an incompleteness, the low self esteem so commonplace in women under male dominance. The sodomy laws are important, perhaps essential, in maintaining for men the superiority of a civil and sexual status over women. They protect men as a class from the violation of penetration. Men's bodies have unbreachable boundaries. A capital crime for thousands of years in the Judeo Christian tradition, viewed with loathing as an obscene violation of male nature. Sodomy suggests a nightmare vision of one kind of sexual equality. Men used by men as women are in sex to satisfy the lust for dominance expressed in the fuck. The power of the gender system, with men on top, depends on keeping men distinct from women precisely in this regard. In sodomy, men can be used as women are used, with real carnal pleasure for the one doing the fucking, and with real carnal pleasure for the one being fucked. The one being fucked also experiences the sensual reality of submission, violation, and being possessed. The creation of gender, so called nature, by law was systematic, sophisticated, supremely intelligent. Behaviors regulated to produce social conditions of power and powerlessness experienced by the individuals inside the social system as the sexual natures inside them as individuals. There were the great, broad laws prohibiting sodomy, prescribing fucking in marriage, directing the fuck to the vagina, not the mouth or the rectum of the woman, because men have mouths and rectums too, legitimizing the fuck when it produces children. Each turn of the screw, so to speak, heightening gender polarity and increasing male power over women. Fucking itself, the way of creating and maintaining that power. Fuck the woman in the vagina, not in the ass, because only she can be fucked in the vagina. Fuck to have children, because only she can have children. Do not waste sperm in sex acts that do not procreate, that are not procreative, because the marital aims of gender are not advanced. Pleasure does not necessarily enhance power. Every detail of gender specificity was attended to in the Old Testament, including cross dressing. Quote, a woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whosoever doth these things is an abomination unto the Lord thy God. End quote. Deuteronomy 22:5. A woman had to be a virgin, or she could be killed. Quote, but if this thing be true, that the tokens of virginity were not found in the damsel, then they shall bring out the damsel to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her with stones. that she die. End quote. Deuteronomy 22, 20-21. The regime of fear was established through a threat of death, and the regime of fear created sex roles called nature. Laws mandating gender specific dress as God's will, gender specific virginity, vagina specific fucking, and the legitimacy of the fuck dependent on producing a child shaped the nature of intercourse as well as the natures of men and women. Opposites were created. A hierarchy was created. Intercourse expressed both the opposition and the hierarchy. Intercourse became the natural expression of different natures of men and women. Each pushed away from having a common human nature by laws that prohibited any recognition of sameness. Each pushed into a sexual antagonism created by the dominance and submission that was the only intimacy they shared. There were also smaller laws in different countries and cultures created by interpretation. Philosophers and scholars took dogma and embellished it. There were customs that operated with the force of law. Many of the smaller rules were designed to restrain men so that they would not be seduced by pleasure from the obligation of power. Maimonides, in his 12th century codification of sexual ethics according to Hebrew law, said that a man, quote, should not cohabit except to maintain the health of his body and to preserve his race, literally his seed, end quote. Unmarried men were not supposed to hold their penises because then they might have carnal thoughts. Married men were allowed to hold their penises while urinating only. Men were not supposed to have intercourse by artificial light or during the day, except for the scholar who could, quote, envelop himself in darkness by spreading his cloak over himself and then have intercourse, end quote. Men were not supposed to have intercourse with their wives while thinking of other women, nor while drunk, nor, quote, in the midst of strife or hatred, end quote. There are some warnings against coercing the wife, and there are related passages advising the man to have intercourse in the middle of the night when his food is digested. He, quote, should converse and jest a little in order to put her at ease, and he should then cohabit with modesty and not impudence, and he should separate immediately, end quote. Maimonides thought that one purpose of circumcision was, quote, to limit sexual intercourse and to weaken the organ of generation as far as possible, and thus cause man to be moderate, end quote. Coercing the wife is frowned on because it is immoderate, like fucking right after eating. The limitation and regulation of male lust have always been high on the regulation agenda and an implicit part of religious law. But the so-called morality behind the constraints has been brilliantly pragmatic. Male dominance does best, after all, what men do not, generally speaking, fuck themselves to death by fucking whatever they want. Restraint is key to power. The immersion in lust without restraint appears to create a burden of distress, the desperate feeling of craving and addiction. Augustine, living with his mistress, quote, found by my own experience the difference between the restraint of the marriage alliance, contracted for the purpose of having children, and the bargain struck for lust, end quote. Using the woman as he wanted, when he wanted, he felt, quote unquote, sunk in death, quote, wallowing in filth and scratching the itching sore of lust, end quote. The itching sore of lust is an essential standard for determining obscenity in contemporary law. Prurience, an element of obscenity, means itch in the context of lust. In male-constructed systems of law, men regulate male lust. The itching sore of lust is deemed by men antisocial, a burden because it must be indulged but can never be satisfied. Laws have tried, and still try, to protect men from the apparently demoralizing experience of being driven by the itching sore of lust beyond what they can either stand or satisfy. The feeling of being dragged down, compulsive, obsessed, is experienced as a form of degradation, of a form of suffering. Restless and driven, the men who have ultimate carnal power find themselves the opposite of free, even though they are on top. Quote unquote, its deadly pleasures, wrote Augustine of Lust, quote, were a train that I dragged along with me, yet I was afraid to be freed from it, end quote. In social terms, male dominance does best when men are not, in Augustine's words, quote, more a slave of lust than a true lover of marriage, end quote. Marriage is the legal ownership of women, the legal intercourse that is the foundation of male authority. The principle that, quote unquote, the personal is political belongs to patriarchal law itself, originating there in a virtual synthesis of intimacy and state policy, the private and the public, the penis and the rule of man. The regulation of men in intercourse is a prime example. It is not enough to have power as a birthright. Power must be kept over living human beings born to rebellion, arguably a human trait, against a human potential. The regulation of men in sex creates a seamless state of being, internal and external, experiencing the world as real and imposed on the body, experiencing in the body as real as imposed on the world, in the body and in the world called nature. The restraint on men, operating inside and outside, is efficient, smart about power. Men are not supposed to fuck until they dropped. There would be fewer foot soldiers in the war, and the psychological and existential burden of carnality is complex, difficult, tending toward a collapse of the personality and self control. And men had an affirmative obligation to use the fuck to create and maintain a social system of power over women, a social and political system in which the fuck, regulated and restrained, kept women compliant, a sexually subjugated class, because of how laws organized male sexuality, the sexual practices and feelings of men. Men experienced a physiologically real desire to subjugate women through sex, and to the extent that women were or could be formed by men to desire subjugation, the system itself was carried on the backs of women in the doggy position. The legal fuck helped to create compliance by defining the woman's body as breachable, owned through the fuck. The legal fuck, what a man may and must do to a woman for the purpose of producing child, also kept men safe from the illegal fuck, the fuck that erased a crucial distinction between men and women. And if lust were lawless, not just an ecstatic expression of dominance over women, but lawless with respect to gender itself, men would be subject to violation the way women are, and male power could not survive either the indignity or the terror of that. Men can, of course, break laws for the sake of pleasure. Maimonides suggests flogging as a punishment for men who have, quote, intercourse within forbidden unions, whether by way of sexual organs or by way of lustful embracing or kissing, thus deriving pleasure from carnal proximity, end quote. The punishment is both minor and unlikely, because power brings with it prerogatives that must be balanced against the prescription and proscription of the law. Men can break laws in ways that are foul and repellent, yet remain immune from punishment. For instance, quote, everyone agrees that he who has sexual intercourse with a deceased, forbidden relative does not incur any punishment at all, end quote. Maimonides declares in the 12th century version of Boys Will Be Boys. Men can break sexual laws with the above immunity, or men can break sexual laws with the secret but empirically real sanction of the male dominated community that establishes social policy as long as that community is not outraged. That is, as long as another man's rights over women are not violated, and as long as the social policy in general is working effectively to protect gender polarity, male nature and female nature. Social outrage is power protecting itself. It is not morality. There is always a tension between the law that protects male, power basic fundamentalism, religious or secular, and men's wanting to break that law. exercise the privilege of power for the sake of pleasure. And so there are political parties and philosophies that are in social, civil, and religious conflict. Men disagree about how much license men should have to break the laws that men make to protect male power. Note, the spread of religious fundamentalism throughout the world right now is men retrenching to undo the civil and social advances of women, to reestablish male power as a fundamental reality by establishing gender as an absolute. This requires a rigorous tightening of restraint on male sexual behavior, as well as intensifying civil and sexual controls on women. End note. How much license can men take without destroying the effectiveness of the laws that formally restrain them in order to protect their own power as men? Can men violate the rules that keep gender intact without compromising male dominance, fatally wounding it? Which laws are fundamental, essential, to maintaining the authority of men over women? Which laws are fundamental, essential, to keeping male dominance the basis of how society is organized, how rights are apportioned, how power is distributed? Which laws can be broken, abandoned, or even repealed without imperiling male supremacy? Can sodomy, for instance, become a legal form of intercourse without irredeemably compromising male power over women? That power premised on men being entirely distinct from women in use, in function, in posture, in position, in role, in quote unquote nature? Or will the legalization of sodomy, making it a legal form of intercourse, morally injure the class power of men, by sanctioning a fuck in which men are treated like women, the boundaries of men's bodies no longer being, as a matter of social policy and divine right, inviolate? The regulation of men by men in sex for the sake of upholding the power of men as a class is the least recognized, least scrutinized aspect of both male dominance and law as an institution of social control. The overt uses of law to keep women sexually subservient and civilly inferior to men are more familiar. But many sexual laws that mandate a low civil status for women actually serve, first and foremost, to uphold male supremacy by keeping peace among men, creating an internal cohesion in the ruling class. Women are property. Adultery, rape, and some forms of incest hurt the rightful owners of the women by damaging the value of the goods or by violating the man's integrity through violating his legal and deeply felt personal right of private, exclusive sexual access. Following the rules that let men have sexual access to subjugated women while moderating male male conflict over that access. Rights of ownership are delineated because inside the community of men itself, relations are ordered precisely by the laws that regulate women as property. Men have a strong self-interest in having property rights over their own women respected. This gives men a strong self-interest in law over lawlessness. The law represents the best interests of men. Lawlessness, the threat of social disintegration. Fierce intramale conflict over women, for instance, or even the potential dominance of lawless women over men. The personal is political here too, because the social rights of dominance over women become personal rights integrated into a man's identity. Ownership of women becomes synonymous with the power and integrity of the individual male. Example, quote, "The nakedness of thy father's wife thou shalt not uncover. It is thy father's nakedness." End quote. Leviticus 18:8. Fuck her and you fuck him. And ultimately, the law exists to keep men from getting fucked by men. The law creates the female, inferior by nature, a lower civil and sexual status, inherent in what she is, how and why she was made, inferior in existence right from the beginning. There are two stories of the creation of so called mankind in Genesis. In the first, quote, "And God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them," end quote. Genesis 1:27. In the second, man is created first, singular and alone. He is dissatisfied and lonely. God parades all of creation before him, but he cannot find a companion. Finally, quote, "And the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, and closed up the place with flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord had taken from the man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And the man said, This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man, and they shall be one flesh." End quote. Genesis 2:21-24. Affirmed by God as one flesh, and claimed by a sinless but nonetheless arrogant man as bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She was his because she was of him, derived from him. Jurists for centuries thereafter recognized a man and his wife as one flesh, the man's. The first story of creation is nearly an equality model. It did not resonate in Judeo Christian systems of law. Nowhere does it appear as a model for the system of secular law that take the Bible as a source of civic or social morality. The second story makes women clearly subservient to the man, even in paradise, before sin or shame or the invention of death. She is inferior in her existence as such. She was created for him to be his. Bone of his bones, flesh of his flesh. She belongs to him in her flesh, which was his flesh. There is no closer, more intimate meaning of belonging to, made for him from him, bone of his bones, flesh of his flesh. And God affirms that they are one flesh. Then the woman eats from the tree of knowledge, her inferior nature manifesting in the weakness that allows her to be seduced by a snake. She disobeys God and eats the apple. She seduces her husband into eating the apple. All the bone of my bones business disappeared, in a sense, forever. She and he are one flesh, in that he has sovereignty over her body, but they are different from then on. Her bones not reminding one of his at all. Her flesh so different from his that it might as well have been made out of some different material altogether. She never was much like him at all, it seems in retrospect, according to all the legal eagles, religious and secular, even ever after until feminism. God curses the woman. Quote, "On to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy pain and thy travail. In pain thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." End quote. Genesis 3:16. God curses the man too, saying that he will work and swear and suffer and die, makes them clothes and expels them from Eden. Immediately on being expelled, quote, and the man knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, end quote, Genesis 4:1. The Jerusalem Bible translation in modern English is more direct. Quote, the man had intercourse with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, end quote, Genesis 4:1. Eve's curse is in the pain of childbirth and in feeling desire for her husband. They are her punishments. The rule of the husband over the wife is in sexual intercourse itself. His sovereignty over her is in the fuck. The New Testament is less direct, but not at all ambiguous in saying the same. Quote, for the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. End quote. 1 Corinthians 11:8-9. According to one Christian writer of the modern era, this means that the wife, quote, willingly accepts the fact that the man is the head of the woman and submits to her husband's authority, not grudgingly and in fear, but willingly, freely, and in joy. End quote. In Christianity, attitude is everything. In Judaism, simple compliance is. In each faith, the man's authority means that he has a right, supported by law, divine law, to fuck his wife. Her legal duty is to submit, and intercourse itself is a legally defined hierarchy in which one who fucks has sovereignty over the one who submits. Human codes of law replicate the hierarchy in intercourse established by divine will. Intercourse is the legally prescribed right of a man over his wife. In The Total Women, Maribel Morgan, who never disappoints, provides her own unique biblical exegesis when she wrote, quote, God understood women. He knew they would probably use the prized possession of sex to manipulate men, and he warned against rationing it out, end quote. A Mrs. Ellis in 1846, despite her Victorian upbringing, was more straightforward in language and also had a keener appreciation of sexual politics when she wrote, quote, in her intercourse with man, it is impossible but that woman should feel her own inferiority, and it is right that it should be so. She does not meet him on equal terms. Her part is to make sacrifices in order that his enjoyment may be enhanced. She does this with a willing spirit, but she does it so often without grateful acknowledgement. Nor is the man to be blamed for this. End quote. Being grateful is the celebration of one's inferiority. As Mrs. Ellis suggests, it is uncommon. The metaphysical ground rule for male and female were set in Genesis in the beginning. The implications have been comprehended deeply and honored into law and practices. The implications go far beyond the letter of the law, especially beyond the specific small laws that regulate the when and how of intercourse. The implications honor the basic law, men's ownership of women through intercourse. As Maimonides explains, quote, since a man's wife is permitted to him, he may act with her in any manner whatsoever. He may have intercourse with her whenever he so desires, and kiss any organ of her body he wishes, and he may have intercourse with her naturally or unnaturally, provided that he does not expand sperm to no purpose. End quote. All the tangle of rules that govern when a woman is accessible to her husband and in what ways, all the rules that make her off limits some times of the month, or prescribe sexual intercourse in the vagina, or prescribe sexual intercourse in the mouth or in the rectum, all the rules are suspended when the man wants them to be because of his authority over his wife, except that his semen, the totem of his power as a man, must be ejaculated into her vagina. Her capacity to get pregnant redeeming him from the gender ambiguity of any sex act he might commit for his own pleasure. She has no right of refusal. She is his, not flesh of his flesh, at all in terms of rights and dignity, dignity of being, but belonging to him in sex. His authority over her expressed in sexual rights over her, which, in the end, are absolute. Inside this system of rights and obligations, forcing intercourse or any other sex act on a wife cannot be rape. The intercourse is legal, and so the force used to effect it is legal too. The sanctioning of rape in marriage by law is usually traced to the jurist Matthew Hale, Chief Justice in England in the 17th century. He wrote, quote, "But the husband cannot be guilty of rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife, for by their mutual matrimonial consent and contract the wife hath given up herself in this kind unto the husband which she cannot retract." End quote. The decision itself, however, suggests that by the 17th century in England there was a substantial challenge to the sexual rights of a husband over a wife. The husband's authority was rooted in biblical law and enhanced by secular laws that had for centuries defined the wife as chattel, forbade her to own her own property, and deprived her of all civil rights and liberties because of her sex. Contemporary feminists continue to challenge the male sexual sovereignty over women in marriage in efforts to criminalize rape in marriage. Traditional rape laws in modern society, quote, usually defined rape as the forcible penetration of the body of a woman, not the wife of the perpetrator, end quote. Some states have made forced intercourse in marriage a crime. Some states require that the wife be physically and legally separated from the husband before forced intercourse be recognized as rape. Some states have actually, by statute, extended the right of marital rape to cohabitating men or to so-called voluntary social companions. The legal fight here goes right to the heart of the woman's legal status and whether the status will change or not. Will the metaphysical laws of male dominance articulated in Genesis prevail, or will the state enforcement of those laws of gender and female inferiority be ended? Will intercourse remain the fundamental expression of male rule over women, a legal right protected by the state, especially in marriage? Or will this protected institution of male dominance, intercourse in marriage, be modified or reformed through changes in statutory laws? And what will the consequences of such reform be for men, for women, for intercourse? Or will the rights of husbands over wives be legally extended to unmarried men over unmarried women so that intercourse functions as a state sanctioned domination not only in marriage but also outside of it? The right of a man to use his wife the way he wants has been the essential meaning of sexual privacy in law. The state, to quote one Florida legislator who opposed criminalization of rape in marriage, quote, has absolutely no business intervening in the sexual relationships between a husband and a wife, end quote. The state, of course, has created that relationship and has protected the husband's forced access to the wife. And it is the above conception of privacy, keeping the wife sexually subjugated to the husband as a matter of law, statutory, metaphysical, divine, that cloaks the abuse of wives in a legitimacy and a secrecy that stop active, cogent, material interference. The down to earth meaning of this privacy was eloquently stated by Bob Wilson, a state senator from California, talking to women lobbyists in 1979. Quote, "But if you can't rape your wife," end quote, the lawmaker asked, quote, "who can you rape?" End quote. The answer, of course, is no one. Freud, writing about law and authority in Totem and Taboo, noted that, quote, touching is the first step towards attaining any sort of control over or attempting to make use of a person or object, end quote. Anyone whose legal status is that she exists to be touched intimately inside the boundaries of her own body is controlled, made use of, a captive inside a legally constructed cage. A man's use of his wife follows the law, obeying it. He can also break the law by having illegal intercourse. The breaking of the law itself becomes an eroticized part of the sex. Sex is intensified as a violation of boundaries when laws are violated. Quote, if I had no consciousness of taboos, end quote, wrote Kobo Abe in The Face of Another, in the persona of the man with a new face who had wanted to fuck his wife as if he were a stranger, quote, it would be doubtful whether I could feel such shuddering fascination, end quote. Not only does the law then create gender, female inferiority, as an ecology of male power, it itself is the guidance, the signpost for sex outside the law. It says where, how, when, and in what ways to be lawless. Sex exists on both sides of the law, but the law itself creates the sides. One side emphasizes the utility of sex for power. The other side emphasizes the utility of sex for pleasure. Quote, it is quite impossible, end quote, Abe writes, quote, to be aimlessly erotic about one's wife, end quote. The right that one has to her is lawful, in the service of the state, no matter what one does to her. Raping her, with a rare exception, is lawful. Brutalizing her is within the spirit of the law. To be outside the law, breaking so-called taboos, is a practice of pleasure or many pleasures that appear to be in opposition to legal intercourse. There is a false appearance of freedom from law when one is simply following the sexual topography the law itself has created. The law says what is lawless with precision, in detail, drawing lines the lawless adhere to. In keeping men or masculinity supreme in value or in subordinating women through sex, legal or illegal, one does the law's real work. The law lets men work both sides of it and uses both the legal and the illegal fuck to create conditions of inferiority for women. Conditions that, not coincidentally, keep women divided from one another. The illegal fuck, for instance, keeps the prostitute incarcerated in a ghetto hellhole of sexual subservience, while the legal fuck keeps the wife used, controlled, sexually subservient in the home. The legal and the illegal create the legal and the illegal woman, but the law controls what it created, how it was, how in what circumstances, under what conditions. The kind and quality of subordination each is subjected to, the inferior status of each, the role of intercourse in the subordination of each. Law creates lawlessness, and in each sphere, intercourse is political dominance, power as power, or power as pleasure.